Video game worlds sometimes tend to be a bit generic, a bit samey, a bit, oh look, we saw Lord of the Rings and liked it so much we just made that. Or why bother actually making an interesting place and not just set the game in Afghanistan for the billionth time, or let's invade the US, no, let's invade New York, yes, exactly, New York for the 50th billionth, kajillionth, millionth, zillionth time. Why are people so obsessed with setting every game in New York? Well, it's the greatest city ever made, don't you know? No, that would currently be probably Tokyo, and if we're talking historically then, well, there's Uruk, there's Babylon, there's Rome, there are other places you can set your game in. And to highlight that fact, this is the top 7 best fictional video game worlds. The best, most interesting, most unique video game worlds ever made. Now, they specifically have to be video game worlds. It can't be Faerun because that was made for a board game. It can't be The Witcher's world because that was made for a book series. It can't be Star Wars because it was a movie. These game worlds need to be unique, need to have something that sets them apart from the rest. They have to be identifiable, memorable. So they probably won't rank up in terms of popularity or in terms of size, but more in terms of just exactly what they accomplished. That being said, let's start with number 7, Fallout. There have been post-apocalyptic games before Fallout. After all, this game was supposed to be Wasteland 2, but at the time, Interplay didn't have the rights to Wasteland because they were still with Electronic Arts, so they made Fallout instead. But Fallout brought something different to this setting: aesthetics. This game defined what a post-apocalyptic world looks like, and it's something that's been seen again and again in just about every other post-apocalyptic game ever made. Yeah, sure, it does take influences from stuff like Mad Max, but it had its own spin on things. It had robots, it had that retro vibe to it, that 50s sci-fi push into the actual future vibe. It had the exact color palette it needed to make the world seem radioactive, and it had that music by Mark Morgan that just made it feel post-apocalyptic. It sounded right, it looked right, it defined what right post-apocalyptic games should look like, which is why they kind of all look the same now. Still, can't fault Fallout for doing it well. Number 6, Mass Effect. When they couldn't do Star Wars anymore, BioWare went to work on creating their own universe, their own sci-fi sprawling epic that was filled with something that Star Wars sort of lacked in a lot of its aspects: explanations. Because when you get down to it, explanations ruined Star Wars. Midichlorians. You know that word, right? Most of you hate it. Well, that explained the Force and no one liked it. But in Mass Effect, they could do everything and make it all rational, reasonable, logical. And they did. This game had an amazing attention to detail. The first Mass Effect game was a world-building masterpiece. It even told you the most pointless of details, like why the Normandy was built that way, why the captain's quarters were there. It went into all sorts of details that just made it fantastic. The kind of world that you can explore, and as you do, you keep finding out stuff about it. Stuff that's interesting, that seems so natural. This is what made Mass Effect a pleasure to play in spite of its, well, the exploration aspect was more like, here's a barren planet, it has a base on it, that base is made up of the same 5 rooms you've seen on every other base in every other planet, but now the doors are in a different position. So maybe it didn't build worlds graphically or geometrically that well, the secondary ones I mean, but the main part of it was fantastic. Now sure, every other game beyond the first one completely screwed up the world building and just sabotaged it to the point where you just kinda get the feeling it's someone at BioWare really hated Mass Effect. I mean, they really despised all the work and attention to detail that went into the series before they came on board. Almost like Eric Cartman started doing Mass Effect and thought, I'll show you world building, I can do world building even better than you, and just screwed everything up completely, majestically, foobarring everything into oblivion. And I'm not talking just about the ending. Mass Effect 2 had problems. Most of Mass Effect 3 had problems. Problems that turned this once great universe to absolute crap. Number 5, the Ultima Universe. The concept of a continuous video game universe wasn't really that much of a thing back in the day. More or less, every game had its own place, had its own characters, its own continuity, because a continuous universe wasn't really what people expected. And then Ultima came. Now this was around the early 1980s, so when Ultima came, there weren't that many video games to begin with that actually tried to have this concept. But over the course of almost 2 decades, Ultima evolved this concept and actually made something with it. This was a game world that evolved with time. It wasn't just continuous, it was evolutionary, because from one game to another it evolved, it changed, reflecting the actions of the characters. This is a game world that you shaped, whose characters you shaped by becoming the figurehead of its new religion. And then you got to see this religion twisted, corrupted, and used to oppress people, and actually leading to genocide. And the world continued to evolve, asking questions like, what point does this religion even have? And then introduced even better questions like, what right did this philosophy, this religion have in the first place to exist when it was built on the suffering of others, on the exclusion of others? Also, it was kind of built on a big lie, if you think about it. This was a complex world that you got to experience as it was being shaped, as it was being molded by you, by the player, by your actions through the story. It wasn't a world that had a ton of lore through which you had to go reading things that sometimes turned out to be better than the story of the actual game. No, this was something that you experienced, something that you helped create. And that certainly sets Ultima apart. Number 4, Gothic. Fantasy realism. This is what Gothic brought to the table. There had been games before that tried to do it, like Darklands, some of the Ultima games even, but Gothic did it on every level. This wasn't just about a fantasy setting. This was about an actual world, a complicated, multi-layered entity that existed in the games, and, well, at least in 2 of them. The level design in those 2 Gothic games was beyond everything you have seen in a video game ever. I guarantee it. The way the characters interacted with that world was again something amazing because they behaved like real human beings, and they did that back in about 2000. Way before everyone jumped on the Radiant AI bandwagon. And it wasn't just the NPCs, the human characters, it was also the creatures in the forests and the swamps. They behaved like animals, not like mobs waiting to be killed. They would sleep at night, they would be startled, they would run away. They would warn you to not come close. They would mark their territory. They would only attack because you got too close, because you insisted. The forests themselves felt so real because they had little leaves falling down from time to time. And this was about 3 years before Morrowind came along, whose forests were basically one tree in the middle of the road. In this game, you could go anywhere. You could climb to the roof of a house and just start running until you got to the wall of a citadel. Ultima had this as well, but this game did it right in 3D. It had a proto-parkour, if you will. You could even climb trees. Well, you could fall on the branches of trees from higher up and you could stay there, laughing at the orcs below and shooting them if you had a bow. It was also a game where the progression of your character was visible and tangible. It wasn't just stats. You could actually see him shoot better with a bow, hit better with a sword, move better, sneak better. It wasn't just increasing stats. The animations changed. It was seamless. Everything in this world was just seamless. And that's what made Gothic magnificent. Number 3, Anachronox. While games can be realistic, they can be believable, they can be seamless, Anachronox was special because while it was believable in its way, it was also crazy, insane, bonkers mad, howling at the moon lunacy levels, which all made sense in this universe because everything was insane here. Insane yet logical. As I've mentioned in the show dedicated to this game, you went up against comic book supervillains, as in they were from a comic book. The game itself treated them like a comic book with those kind of dialogue screens, with word balloons. You even had a playable character that was one of those superheroes with the word balloon, so he didn't talk that much. You had a planet as a playable character, an actual planet that shrank itself down and was filled with people obsessed with democracy, and would also fire nukes as its ultimate ability. It was basically the US as a playable character. The level of creativity you see in Anachronox is rare, amazingly rare, because most games can't even come close to this. Probably the ones that did would be the Rayman Origins games in terms of how the levels look, because, well, at one time you would just run around on music. And that's the kind of insane thing, that kind of marvelous thing you'd expect to see more often in games, but you don't. That's what set Anachronox apart from the rest. It had a great big universe and it was very silly. Number 2, Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. Now there have been games that approach the idea of the Industrial Revolution and the magic coexisting in some way. The Thief games did it to some point, but no game did it like Arcanum, a Victorian age. Style-wise, because it wasn't in the Victorian age, since there was no Queen Victoria, this game didn't take place on Earth. You had a world of magic, a world with elves, with dwarves, with trolls, with all sorts of other creatures, where wizards existed, where magic flowed freely. And in this world, the Industrial Revolution happened, and the game explained every consequence that had, everything it implied. It showed you exactly what the Industrial Age, even a mere 50 years after it began, could do to this world. How one engine showed by one dwarf to one curious child could change an entire world. It could drive species to extinction. It could cause genocide. It could shift the balance of power and bring about new ages of prosperity and discrimination. Also, this game had a great story that fully utilized this game world. And in terms of gameplay in this world, I'd like to mention that this is the only truly interactive video game world, because in this world, you could enter windows. You could open a window and go through it on purpose without abusing bugs like in Fallout. This is rare. This is downright unique for an RPG. You'd think people would be more okay with the idea of using windows in their games since, well, they're mostly made for Windows these days. Arcanum had a beautifully detailed world where things such as necromancy could coexist with a steam railroad, and it was wonderful. But not as wonderful as number 1, the Might and Magic universe. Now this may come as a shock to you, but the Might and Magic games and the Heroes of Might and Magic games are not set in a fantasy universe. They're set in a very sophisticated, very advanced sci-fi universe. One where magic is technology, or at least it was up until Ubisoft came along and thought, no no, that would be too complex for people to understand. Let's just make a generic fantasy. Let's copy Warcraft and stuff. And they did. Though to be fair, Ubisoft were completely right because the people that played Heroes of Might and Magic 3 were just, how shall I put this? They made a campaign to remove any sort of sci-fi elements from a future expansion of the game, and thusly the entire franchise. A franchise that started out as a combination of fantasy and really advanced science fiction because it was more or less about a race so advanced that it started seeding other planets using gigantic vehicles that rocketed through space on which other worlds existed. Each of them had their own ecosystems with their own creatures and societies that were modeled after ancient civilizations. Well, ancient to the people in the far future because they were mostly medieval. And from those civilizations, new worlds would spring up. Worlds with people that would have access to newer technology when they were evolved enough to use it. Technology that you can actually clearly see in the earlier Might and Magic games. And I'm not just talking about the crashed spaceships or the blasters, but in the way it was designed in every facet of the game. Were you to just look at the close-ups of armor and buildings, you would see that those aren't your typical fantasy affairs of just standard brick, mortar, metal. No. They looked like high-tech cybernetics, nanomachines, futuristic stuff in general because that's what they were. That's what everything was, and this world, this concept could have been exploited so well over the last 20 years. But it wasn't because people, loudmouth, obnoxious people, just wanted their standard fantasy, and that's what they got. That's what they doomed the soul to have because of their small minds, unable to grasp multifaceted game worlds that existed beyond a simple singular setting, beyond one central theme. And to this day, there hasn't been any one thing able to rival what Might and Magic meant a long time ago, and what it could mean now had it been used properly, had it been exploited to its full potential. The kind of gameplay you could have in this universe, the kind of stories you could tell, so many possibilities lost. And that's it for the top 7 best video game worlds. If you have one that you particularly like, make sure to mention it in the comments. And if you can, please do play World of Xen and all the other games I've mentioned so far.
If you enjoyed this show, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Or, if you thought it was horrible, then share it with your enemies and make them suffer. We shall be your weapon of vengeance. But if you liked what you saw, you could, I don't know, maybe donate because basically YouTube is horrible at revenue by using the link in the description, or just buy my book. It's a fantasy book about, well, a lot of stuff. I guarantee it won't suck, and if it does suck, you can find me here and complain about it.